The new growth projection is 1% higher than the multilateral institution's 2021 forecast in January, as January's forecast was a downward review from forecasts shared in October 2020. According to the World Bank, the country's economy is expected to grow by 1.8% in 2021, though there is high uncertainty about the outlook as the high inflation and high unemployment rates exacerbate macroeconomic risk, and activities in the tertiary sector will not fully normalize unless COVID-19 is totally contained. The bank's report also shows that by the end of 2021, Nigeria's GDP is likely to approach its 2010 level, thus reversing a full decade of economic growth. Dr. Muda Yusuf is already standing by. He's the Director General of Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Good afternoon, Dr. Yusuf. Thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with you.
Let me start with what do you think is the rationale behind all of these projections and reprojections from all of these institutions, particularly with regards to Nigeria in recent times? We hear figures for economic growth, and in a few months they are back again to tell us that this is what we should expect, and most of the fundamental issues remain the same.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think this is a reflection of the changing dynamics in the global economy. Because as some of these fundamentals change, our projections will change. And from what we have seen that the global economy is beginning to recover. The domestic economy is also beginning to recover. So that, I think, is one major factor that is responsible from this changing nature of the forecast. And you will notice that the changing nature are positive in nature. They have been increasing. And that is also signaling the fact that the economic environment is improving. First, on the back of the fact that the COVID situation is beginning to slow down. Secondly, specifically for Nigeria, is the fact that a major driver of growth in the economy, which is the oil sector, is beginning to recover. We have seen consistent recovery over the last couple of months, and there are projections that this will be sustained till the end of the year. So these basically are the basis for the optimistic outlook that have been projected both by the World Bank and the IMF. In fact, the IMF projection is even more optimistic. It's talking about 2.5% growth by the end of the year. Of course, in all of this, there were issues raised about what we need to do in order to ensure resilience of the economy, principally issues around reforms. Because if you look at what the World Bank presented, the report, the title of the report is Resilience Through Reforms. So we need reforms to be able to drive resilience. And quite a number of these reforms were outlined. Some, I'm sure, will be agreeable by many. Some of those prescriptions may not sit well or resonate well with some of our economic managers. So maybe as we proceed, we can be looking at the specifics about the prescriptions on reforms.
All right, talking about reforms now, Dr. Yusuf, prompt government interventions and lifting pandemic restrictions and, of course, rising oil prices, and like you identified, because of the pickup when the global economy is on one side. And on the other side is the re-emergence of subsidies around PMS, electricity, and of course, this is affecting or expanding FG's fiscal space. Now, how do you put this together? How do we balance all of this?
Well, talking about reforms, both the IMF and the World Bank seem to be practically on the same page as far as reforms are concerned. And the first item that was highlighted by the IMF, for instance, was to commend the move by the CBN to promote the convergence of the exchange rate. The CBN only recently adopted the NAFEX rate as the official exchange rate, which is what the IMF and the World Bank have been clamoring for over time. And in fact, even some domestic commentators on the economy. So that, I think, is a step in the right direction. But from what the IMF said and from what the World Bank is saying, there's still a need to do a lot more in that direction, because the general perception or feeling is that the NAFEX rate as it stands today is still not reflective of what the market rate is. Because when you talk of a market rate, you talk of a rate that will clear the market. A rate at which, if you want to buy forex, you always have access to buy the forex. But that is not exactly the story with the NAFEX window today. So I think there's still a lot of reforms that needs to be done around the foreign exchange market. A good first step has been taken. I think these institutions feel that there's still a lot more that needs to be done around the foreign exchange reforms. Then, of course, there is the issue of the trade, the policies on trade. Although the central bank is essentially a monetary institution, but some of its policies impede a lot on the trade environment, particularly the foreign exchange policy. And the World Bank was highlighting the fact that this whole idea of restricting access to foreign exchange for some sectors is exactly not something that is investment friendly. The World Bank has canvassed that this should be reviewed, and we should allow the market to function. We should allow more openness in trade. Of course, the argument of the central bank is that we need to protect domestic production. We need to also protect the pressure, our reserves, from coming under very serious pressure. These things are debatable, but again, what we feel is more sustainable is to get the CBN to focus more on strictly monetary policy issues and leave the issues of trade to the trade institutions and, of course, the fiscal policy institutions. Because right now, it seems that the CBN is getting on the way of trade policy. Because you cannot undertake any form of trade unless you have foreign exchange. And if the CBN is the custodian of the foreign exchange and is saying that you can use FX for this, you cannot use it for this, it becomes a trade policy issue. So we need to ensure that you have proper alignment of policies around this matter between the fiscal authorities, the trade authorities, the investment authorities, and of course the Central Bank of Nigeria. Because the framework for even determining what should be in the Forex exclusive list, what should not be in the Forex exclusive list, is also an issue that one will have to interrogate. So this is a major step that we need to do if we really want to get a sustainable reform measure. Then, of course, concerns were raised around the CBN funding of deficits, which we call in economic parlance fiscal deficit monetization by the Central Bank of Nigeria. That has a lot of implications for the stability of the economy, for the macroeconomic stability, and it has very, very serious implications for inflation as well. So this is an issue that I think we need to deal with. If you are talking about promoting resilience in the economy, we need to review it drastically. And the argument, which is also proper by the central bank, by the World Bank, is that we need to restrict the CBN financing of deficit strictly to what the law allows. I think it's about 5% or so of the actual revenue of the previous year. But right now, what we have is far in excess of that. So that again is an issue. And of course, there is the issue of social protection, which is also very okay. Right now, the World Bank is talking about conditional cash transfers and all of that. Again, we need to look at the framework. There have been issues and stories about the transparency and the effectiveness of this methodology of reaching out to the poor, because we have issues of database, you have issues of cash handling and all of that. So we need to have a proper framework that will actually ensure There's effective delivery of these cash transfers to those who really needed it. And of course, the MSMEs. MSMEs, employ the largest number of people. They have the greatest potentials to create jobs. Issues of creating the right environment around the MSME space is also a very critical factor. Because apart from policy issues, a lot of them complain about regulatory environment. They complain about infrastructure issues. They complain about the tax environment and all of that. So all of these things are very critical to building resilience through reforms. So the reforms that the IMF and the World Bank are talking about are around all of these issues. And of course, the issue of fuel subsidy, that's a major one. Of course, the IMF and the World Bank are very specific that these things should be removed. But again, we need to situate this within the context of the political context, the social context, and all of that. Because some of these things are not as straightforward as they appear. Because of the possible backlash, because of the political cost and the social cost. So I think the narrative or the conversation around this should be how the government can come up with a framework that will allow for a very easy transition from the current policy regime to a fully deregulated regime, because that ultimately is the destination. But I know that a conversation is still going on between Labour and the government on how to make these things happen. Then, of course, electricity tariff is also a very knotty issue. Of course, a lot of tariff reviews have been effected. The consumers are complaining. The power sector investors are saying that the tariff is not high enough. Again, we have a very serious balancing act to be done as far as electricity tariffs are concerned. So for some of these policy reform prescriptions, there are other dimensions that we need to look at properly. There's a political dimension, there's a social dimension, and we need to situate all of these things within the context of the environment in which we operate. So those are the critical areas and issues that have been raised both by the World Bank and the IMF.
Now, Dr. Yusuf, I like to also see this, number one, as very ambitious. Let me look at it that way. Looking at inflation down, they are projecting that by the second half of the year, inflation could be down as much as 15.5%, I think, towards ending the year, and also 2.5% growth that we also identified. Now, with the continuous, with the expected deregulation, and of course, maybe a free market for our foreign exchange, in our foreign exchange space, do you see us reaching this figure when regards to inflation, 15.5, when some still feel that inflation might still go higher, considering the expectation of maybe whatever price PMS would sell at?
Well, the World Bank specifically anchored its projection on first, I think there is the issue of the seasonality of harvest. Secondly, more importantly, it's about the base effect. Because if the base effect is such that when you compare, because don't forget, the inflation is year on year. So what happens last year will have a major effect on what the inflation outcomes will be. So if, for instance, you already have a high level last year and you are looking at year on year, it is possible that the difference will be much lower. So the base effect is a very significant effect. I take your point that if we go through the processes of the deregulation of the downstream, that may have its own inflationary implication. Of course, that is true. But again, if we get the reforms right and we, ensure that we inspire a lot more confidence in investors over the next few months, we are likely to see a much bigger improvement or increase in output or productivity. Because no matter what happens, if there is an environment that allows for much better productivity in the economy, we are likely to see a drop in inflation. And concerning the effect of a market-driven exchange rate, of course, initially we may see an upsurge, an uptrend in the exchange rate, but with time, I'm sure that the exchange rate we find this level, equilibrium level, far, far below what the current rates are. Because the beauty of a market-driven system is that it incentivizes a lot more supply of forex into the economy. We are likely to see a much better inflow from diaspora window, from the foreign portfolio windows, from the FDI windows, and even from export proceeds. If you have a much more unified rate, and if we're able to eliminate all the current premiums that are there. Another advantage of that is that all the artificial pressure on the foreign exchange market coming from speculators, coming from brokers, coming from those who are rent seekers in the foreign exchange market will also be eased. That pressure coming from the demand side will also reduce. So I will have a rate that is much more sustainable and that is much more investment friendly, that is even likely to be much less than what we have. So that is likely to be the scenario going forward if you have a consistent pursuit of these policy reforms around the FX and, of course, around the downstream oil sector.
DG, before we wrap up, tax administration is also key here, particularly at this time where government grapples with revenue challenges. So I think they also advise that we properly harmonize our tax system so that we can mobilize more revenue to help address government issues with liquidity, talking about government spending. What do you make of that move, particularly also at this time? VAT is on one side, a lot of reforms also in that tax in the tax space.
Well, that was one of the major issues flagged by the World Bank. I think to some extent even the IMF, that our tax revenue is perhaps one of the lowest in the world. Whereas compare tax to GDP. Well, it depends on how we look at it. For those of us in the private sector, I can even say that we are being overtaxed. Because if you look at the company tax is 30%. In many other climes, it's far, far, far less than that. But beyond that, apart from the mainstream taxes, that is company tax, withholding tax, VAT, education tax, the telecoms tax, the import duty, the port levy, and all the rest. You have a whole lot of that. There are also other forms of payments which are not often regarded as tax, but they are resources that are extracted from the private sector. For instance, for every regulator that any private sector relates with, there's an amount you pay every year. And sometimes these amounts are not cheap. They're not small. And for some sectors, they could have up to 6 or 7 or even 10 regulators. And for each of these regulators, there are fees you pay. Either they call it licensing fee, they call it permits, they call it a renewal fee, they call it all sorts of names, which you have to pay every year. And the story from many of the regulatory institutions is that they are not properly funded. They have to generate revenue internally. And when they talk about IGR, they are talking about generating the revenue from the entities that they are regulating. Sometimes there are some entities that have to pay a percentage of their revenue or profits to some of these regulators. So when people are talking about low tax regime, perhaps they are not factoring in all these other charges that businesses are paying to all forms of regulators, even in the informal sector. Just recently, I was getting complaints from our Lagos Island markets of how on daily basis the market women, the small traders are being made to pay one form of fee or the other to all sorts of people who are wearing all sorts of reflective jackets in the marketplace. Nobody is talking about, nobody is factoring that. Look at our roads, look at all these transport unions. For every trip that all these vehicles make, do you know how much they pay? It comes into billions of naira on daily basis. So when we talk about the fact that the tax situation is so low and all of that, I think we need to look at it from a much broader perspective. The private sector is parting with a lot more in terms of financial resources, much more than the regular mainstream tax. And some of these things are not reflected in the budget because they are going directly to all these agencies. So we need to look at it so that we have a very clear understanding of the pressure of taxation, the pressure of levies, of fees, on licenses, on renewal fees, on businesses. Sometimes these things can be very high, and it can make businesses and investments unprofitable.
Indeed, it's a good way to leave it, Dr. Muda Yusuf. I see the passion there, talking about these issues. Thank you so much for explaining all of this submissions from IMF and World Bank, letting Nigerians understand what it means for us and, of course, for the private sector players like you. Thank you for spending your time with us. Dr. Muda Yusuf is the Director General, Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Enjoy the rest of your day, sir.
Thank you very much.